The room smelled of stale coffee and desperation. The conference table, once a symbol of success, was now covered in unpaid invoices and hastily scribbled notes. My father, Gerald Carter, sat at the head of the table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring blankly at the spreadsheets before him. His once proud stature had diminished, weighed down by the crushing reality of failure. I watched him, the man who built this company from the ground up, now reduced to a shadow of himself. Carter Global had been a household name in the travel industry, but now it teetered on the edge of bankruptcy. Deals were slipping through our fingers, investors were backing out, and our competitors were circling like vultures. Across from me, my older brother, Zachary, Zach, as everyone called him, sat with his arms crossed, a bored expression on his face. He never had to worry about the business, never had to carry the weight of responsibility. My father adored him, groomed him for leadership despite his lack of effort. Meanwhile, I, the one who had studied, planned, and worked tirelessly, remained unseen, unheard. "The numbers don't lie," our CFO mumbled, flipping through the latest reports. "We have 3 months, maybe less, before we have to declare bankruptcy." Silence settled over the room. "We can cut costs," someone suggested weakly. "We already have," my father replied, rubbing his temples. "We've laid off employees, renegotiated contracts, sold assets. It's not enough." I leaned forward, heart pounding. I had spent months working on a solution, refining an idea that could change everything. But I knew how this would go. My father didn't trust me, and Zach, he didn't care. Still, I had to try. "There's another way," I said. All eyes turned to me. My father exhaled heavily, his patience already worn thin. "Natalie, this is not the time." "This is exactly the time," I interrupted, pushing my laptop forward. "We need a fundamental change, not just cost-cutting. The travel industry is evolving, and we're stuck in the past. That's why we're failing." Zach scoffed. "Oh, here we go. The 'I know better than dad' speech." I ignored him, pulling up the demo. "I've developed a software, Carter Sync. It streamlines travel bookings, optimizes pricing in real time, and integrates AI-driven analytics to reduce operational costs. It's revolutionary. If we implement this, we won't just survive, we'll dominate." I pressed play, showing them the simulation. The projections were clear: cost reductions of 40%, increased efficiency, and an influx of new business. A roadmap out of the disaster we were drowning in. For a moment, there was silence. My father stared at the screen, brow furrowed. Then Zach laughed. "You really think some fancy coding is gonna save this company?" "It's not fancy coding," I shot back. "It's innovation. Something we desperately need." My father sighed. "Natalie, this is impressive. But we don't have the resources to develop something of this scale. It's already developed." I met his gaze, refusing to let him dismiss me. "It's done. I built it." His eyes widened. "You what?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I've been working on it for over a year. I had to bring in some outside developers, but I funded it myself." A flicker of something pride, maybe, crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "You went behind my back?" "To save this company," I said firmly. And I did. The room fell into stunned silence. "Let's say, hypothetically, this works," my father finally said. "How do we convince investors?" I tapped a few keys, pulling up an email from a major corporate travel agency. They've already seen the prototype. They're ready to sign. The disbelief on my father's face was almost laughable. He had spent his entire life believing I was second to Zach, incapable of leading, of making an impact. But now, faced with undeniable proof, he had no choice but to acknowledge me. He sat back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "How much do you need?" I exhaled. This was it. A full rollout would require a 6-month implementation plan, but initial investment can be minimized. "I need decision-making power." Zach shifted uncomfortably. "Hold on. We're not just handing the company over to you." My father hesitated. "Zach, if this works, it could save everything." Zach glared at me. "So what? She gets all the credit?" I met his eyes. No, the company survives. That's what matters. Another silence stretched between us. Then, my father nodded. Fine. You have 3 months. Make it work. The next 3 months were the most grueling of my life. Implementing Carter Sync meant tearing down old processes, retraining employees, and convincing reluctant executives. But I had one thing on my side: results. The moment we launched, everything changed. Our operational costs plummeted. Clients flocked to us. The software was a game changer, and the industry took notice. By the end of the first year, we weren't just surviving. We were thriving. Carter Global had gone from the brink of bankruptcy to a $350 million success story. Investors were pouring in. Analysts called it the greatest turnaround in corporate history. Yet, through it all, one thing remained unchanged: my father and Zach's attitudes toward me. There was no praise, no recognition. At company events, my father spoke about our legacy of resilience, never once mentioning my name. Zach took credit whenever he could, despite having done nothing. I let it go, because at the end of the day, I had saved the company. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval. But deep down, I wondered, if my own family couldn't acknowledge me now, would they ever? I pushed those thoughts away. Success was mine. That was enough. Or so I thought. Because success comes with a cost. And betrayal, especially from those closest to you, is always the highest price to pay. The boardroom felt colder than usual, a quiet tension lingering in the air as I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Across from me, my father, Gerald Carter, tapped his fingers against the smooth surface, his gaze fixed on the financial reports before him. His once confident demeanor had withered under the weight of the company's near collapse, though he'd never admit it. Beside him, my brother, Zach, lounged back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest, his expression one of sheer disinterest. He wasn't worried about the business. He never had been. He was our father's golden boy, always shielded from responsibility, always given more than he earned. And now, as Carter Global found itself on the edge of ruin, he still looked as though he had nothing to fear. I, however, had spent every waking hour fighting to keep us from falling apart. My father cleared his throat. We need solutions. His voice was gruff, the exhaustion evident in the deep lines creasing his face. Investors are losing confidence. We've lost 3 major clients this quarter alone. One of the executives, a gray-haired man in a navy suit, leaned forward. Our competitors have streamlined their operations with newer technology. We've failed to keep up. If we don't modernize, we won't last another year. I exhaled slowly. This was it. My moment. I straightened my posture, my heart pounding. I've already found the solution. A few heads turned in my direction, my father among them, his brow furrowing. I pressed a button on my tablet, and the screen at the front of the room lit up. Carter Sync. The title appeared in bold, followed by a demonstration of the software I had spent the last year building in secret. It's a fully integrated, AI-powered travel management system, I began, keeping my voice steady. It optimizes pricing, reduces operational costs, and enhances customer experience with real-time adjustments. It streamlines every aspect of our business, from supplier negotiations to personalized client packages. A hush fell over the room as the executives watched the simulation play out. Graphs projected cost reductions of up to 40%, and revenue potential soared beyond our current reach. One of the board members adjusted his glasses. And, you built this? I nodded. Over the past year. With my own resources. Zach scoffed, rolling his eyes. So you played around with some coding and think it's going to save us? I clenched my jaw, ignoring him. I've already tested it with a few industry partners. They're ready to sign contracts if we implement it. My father rubbed his chin, his expression unreadable. And what exactly are you proposing? I forced myself to take a breath before answering. That we integrate Carter Sync into our entire system immediately. This isn't just an upgrade, it's a revolution in travel technology. If we move fast, we won't just survive, we'll dominate. Another executive spoke, his voice tinged with skepticism. And how do we fund it? We're already struggling to pay our employees. I tapped the screen again, revealing a list of potential investors. I've secured preliminary interest from venture capitalists who specialize in tech-driven companies. They're willing to invest under one condition. My father's gaze sharpened. What condition? I met his eyes. That I have decision-making power over the project. A tense silence stretched across the room. Zach sat up straighter, his smirk vanishing. Wait, what? My father's expression darkened. You want control? I want authority over something I built, I said, my voice firm. Something that can save us. Zach laughed, shaking his head. This is ridiculous. But it wasn't. Not to the people in this room. The weight of my words settled over them, the reality of our situation sinking in. My father leaned back, drumming his fingers against the table. 3 months, he finally said. You have 3 months to prove this works. I nodded. It was all I needed. Those 3 months were the most intense of my life. Implementing Carter Sync meant dismantling decades of outdated systems, retraining employees, and convincing stubborn executives that change was necessary. But the moment the software went live, everything shifted. Operational efficiency skyrocketed. Clients who had been on the verge of leaving renewed their contracts, enticed by this seamless integration Carter Sync offered. Investors, once hesitant, now clamored to be part of our resurgence. For the first time in years, Carter Global wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. But through it all, one thing remained unchanged: my father's unwavering favoritism toward Zach. Despite my success, Zach continued to be the face of the company, attending high-profile meetings, giving interviews about our innovative direction. At company events, my father spoke proudly of our resilience, never once acknowledging that I had been the one to turn things around. I told myself it didn't matter. I was the one making the real decisions. I was the one who had saved us. But deep down, I wondered if I would ever be more than an afterthought in my own family's eyes. The night before Zach's birthday party, I stood in my office, watching the city lights flicker through the glass windows. I had done everything they said I couldn't. I had built something extraordinary, something that had transformed Carter Global into a powerhouse. Yet I knew, no matter what I did, my father would never see me as his successor. He had already chosen his heir. And the next night, he would prove it. Zach's birthday party was exactly what I expected, an over-the-top spectacle dripping in excess, a testament to my father's endless favoritism. The ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel was transformed into a lavish celebration, decked out in towering crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed decor, and tables overflowing with the finest food and champagne. No expense had been spared. The moment I stepped through the entrance, I felt like an outsider. Guests in tailored suits and designer gowns floated through the room, glasses of vintage wine in hand. I recognized many of them, business partners, industry leaders, investors. They were here not just to celebrate Zach, but to reaffirm their loyalty to the Carter family. Despite everything I had done to save this company, tonight wasn't about me. It never was. I spotted my father in the crowd, standing beside Zach, shaking hands with a group of executives. They all laughed, the sound smooth and practiced. My father's expression was one of pride, as if Zach had accomplished something extraordinary. As if he hadn't coasted through life on a foundation I had built with my own hands. I exhaled slowly, keeping my posture poised as I moved through the room, offering polite nods to those who acknowledged me. Even now, I knew my place. I was tolerated but never truly welcomed. A hand touched my arm. Natalie. I turned to see Mark Wellington, one of our key investors. He smiled warmly, holding his glass aloft. Brilliant work on Carter Sync. You're the reason this company is thriving. I forced a small smile. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that. He tilted his head. I expected tonight to be more of a celebration of your success. I let out a quiet laugh. You and me both. Before he could say anything more, the chime of a spoon against a glass rang through the ballroom, and all conversation hushed. My father stood at the center of the room, his arm draped around Zach's shoulders, his voice commanding as he addressed the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight, he began, his tone rich with authority. It's a special occasion, not just because we're celebrating my son Zach's birthday, but because we're celebrating the future of Carter Global. A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests. I frowned. Something was off. My father continued, a proud smile tugging at his lips. For decades, this company has been a family legacy, built with hard work and vision. And now, I am proud to announce that Carter Global will continue under new leadership. A chill ran down my spine. I knew what was coming before the words even left his mouth. I am officially naming Zachary Carter as my successor, the new CEO of Carter Global. Applause erupted through the room. The sound crashed over me like a tidal wave, drowning out the pounding in my ears. Zach beamed, shaking hands, accepting congratulations like he had done something to deserve this. Like I didn't exist. I stood frozen, my hands clenched at my sides. Every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night, every battle I had fought to save this company gone. In one moment, my father had erased me. I forced my breathing to steady, but the humiliation was a slow, suffocating thing, curling around my ribs. And then, as if the knife in my back wasn't deep enough, my father turned to me. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it out with a smirk. "This," he said, his voice laced with condescension, "is your actual value." A cruel hush fell over the room. Laughter rippled through a few guests. Others looked away, uncomfortable. But all I could see was my father's face, smug and satisfied. I stared at the bill in his hand. A part of me wanted to scream, to shatter the glass in my hand, to tell him exactly what I thought of him, of his favoritism, of his betrayal. But I didn't. I didn't move. I didn't react. Instead, I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that sent a flicker of uncertainty across his face. Then, without a word, I turned and walked away. The moment I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my skin, sharp and bracing. I pulled in a breath, steadying myself. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was planning. Beneath the cold sting of betrayal, a clarity settled over me. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated me, dismissed me, broken me. But they had no idea. No idea that the true power had never been in the title of CEO. It had always been in the foundation I built. Carter Global didn't run on my father's legacy. It ran on my software, my ideas, my innovations. And they had just handed the company to a man who had no idea how to keep it alive. I reached into my purse, pulling out my phone. A single call. That was all it would take. I pressed a contact, lifting the phone to my ear. A familiar voice answered. "Natalie?" I smiled, my voice smooth as steel. "It's time." At exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, the doors of Carter Global's headquarters swung open, and Zach Carter stepped inside, his stride filled with the arrogance of a man who believed he had won. Dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, he adjusted the gold cufflinks on his sleeves, the ones our father had gifted him last night after his grand announcement. Behind him, our father followed, looking well-rested, his face filled with satisfaction. To him, this was the start of a new era, his golden son taking the reins, the company secured under family control. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The moment they entered, the energy in the office was off. The usual buzz of morning activity, the ringing phones, the chatter of employees, the clatter of keyboards, was gone. The atmosphere was tense. Executives whispered among themselves, their expressions tight with concern. Phones went unanswered. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something wrong. Zach barely noticed. He rolled his shoulders back and strode toward the executive floor like he already owned it. But when he reached the main conference room, he paused. Because I was already there. I sat at the head of the table, my posture composed, my fingers tapping lightly against my tablet. The seat he expected to be his was already occupied by me. His smirk faltered. "Natalie, what the hell are you doing here?" I lifted my gaze, meeting his with unshaken calm. "Oh, Zach," I said smoothly, tilting my head. "I think we need to discuss your future, or rather, the lack of it." He blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" My father stepped forward, his brow furrowing. Natalie, you weren't invited to this meeting. I smiled, slow and measured. No, but I invited myself. And trust me, you'll want to hear what I have to say. I turned my tablet around, tapping the screen. Immediately, the large monitor on the wall behind me lit up, displaying a series of legal documents, financial statements, and a single, devastating truth. I leaned forward. 3 years ago, when Carter Global was drowning in debt, you needed capital. Badly. So, you sold shares quickly, quietly, to any buyer willing to invest. My father's expression hardened. We did what was necessary. I smiled, unfazed. Yes, and one of those buyers was me. Silence. Zach scoffed, shaking his head. That's impossible. Oh, but it's not. I swiped to the next document, proof of ownership. I own 51% of Carter Global, which means I am the majority shareholder. Which means I let my words hang, watching their expressions shift. My father went rigid. Zach's smirk vanished. No, he said, shaking his head. That's not. I control the company. I finished for him. Zach's breath hitched, his fingers tightening at his sides. You're lying. I shrugged, tilting my head. Call legal if you'd like. They'll confirm everything. My father stepped forward, his voice low, threatening. Natalie, what are you doing? What am I doing? I repeated, feigning thoughtfulness. Oh, just ensuring the right person is in charge. Zach was still staring at the screen, his jaw tightening. This doesn't change anything. I'm the CEO. I exhaled, almost as if I pitied him. Are you? With a flick of my fingers, I pulled up another document, the licensing agreement for Carter Sync. The travel software that rebuilt this company? That saved it. I tapped the screen again, zooming in on one crucial detail. It doesn't belong to Carter Global. A cold hush fell over the room. It belongs to my separate corporation, Carter Innovations. Zach's face drained of color. My father paled. No. Oh, yes, I said, voice smooth as silk. The software license expires at midnight, which means as of 12 o'clock tonight, Carter Global will lose all access to the very thing that's keeping it alive. My father slammed his fist on the table. You wouldn't dare. I met his gaze, unflinching. I already did. Zach fumbled for his phone, scrolling through messages, his movements frantic. I already knew what he was seeing, clients pulling out, stockholders panicking, employees tendering their resignations. The empire they had stolen from me was collapsing, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. I leaned back in my chair, watching the reality settle in their eyes. For the first time in his life, Zach had to face the consequences of having no real skills, no real leadership. And my father? He was finally realizing the depth of his mistake. He had underestimated me. He had thrown me away, convinced that I was nothing more than an afterthought. But the company he thought was his was never truly his at all. And now, I was about to take it all back. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating. It pressed against the walls, thick with unspoken words, unprocessed shock, and the unmistakable taste of impending ruin. Zach clutched his phone, his fingers tightening around it as he stared at the screen, scrolling, reading, and rereading messages that confirmed the truth he wasn't ready to accept. Our biggest clients were withdrawing their contracts. Investors were in full-blown panic mode. Employees, loyal to the software that made their jobs easier, to me, had already started resigning. The company my father and Zach thought they had won was slipping through their fingers like grains of sand, and the best part? It was all legal. I owned the controlling shares. I owned the software. And they owned nothing but their own arrogance. My father's face was pale, his hands clenching into fists on the table. For the first time in his life, he looked powerless. Natalie, he said, his voice sharp, trying to regain control. This company is your family's legacy. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. No, this company was your legacy. You made that clear when you handed it over to Zach without a second thought. I tapped my fingers against my tablet, my voice steady, measured. You didn't just overlook me, Dad. You erased me. His eyes darkened. And now you want revenge? I tilted my head. No, I want what I built. Zach slammed his palm against the table, pushing to his feet. His face was red, his usual cocky smirk nowhere to be found. This is insane. You can't just shut everything down. I arched a brow. I can, and I will. At midnight, Carter Global loses access to Carter Sync. That means no automated booking, no optimized pricing, no integrated client management. Overnight, this company will be nothing but a name and a pile of outdated spreadsheets. My father inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening. You destroy your own company? I leaned forward, leveling him with a look. You mean the company that you stole from me? His jaw clenched. Zach turned to him, his voice frantic. Dad, do something. But there was nothing to be done. I had played my cards 3 years ago. And today? Checkmate. Zach whirled back to me, his eyes burning with desperation. You can't actually want this company to fail. I studied him for a moment. His panic wasn't just about losing the title of CEO. It was about realizing he had no actual power, no real skill to fix this mess. He had expected everything to be handed to him on a silver platter, just like it always had been. And now? That platter was empty. I sighed, tapping on my tablet again. You have 2 choices. The screen behind me shifted, displaying a legal document. 1. I held up a single finger. I walk away. I take my software, my team, and my clients, leaving this company to collapse overnight. Zach made a strangled noise, his breath catching. Or 2. I lifted a second finger. You both resign, effective immediately. You hand the company back to me, and you walk away as silent partners with a reduced stake. I take control, and Carter Global continues to thrive. My father's entire body stiffened. You want me to step down? I didn't blink. You already did when you named Zach CEO. The silence stretched. Zach scoffed, shaking his head, trying to regain some of his usual bravado. And if we say no? I smiled. Then I hope you enjoy watching the company crumble. My father's hands curled into fists, but he wasn't a fool. He understood what was happening, even if he hated it. And Zach? He was unraveling by the second. You can't do this, he whispered, eyes darting between the documents and me. You wouldn't. I arched a brow. I already did. At that moment, his phone rang. Then my father's. Then one of the executives. The murmurs started. Investors demanding answers. Clients demanding stability. The board members looking around, their faces etched with the realization that they had backed the wrong horse. Zach's hand trembled as he gripped his phone. Dad, we have to stop this. My father exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he reached for the pen on the table. Zach's eyes widened. Dad, what are you doing? My father didn't look at him. He looked at me. And for the first time in my life, there was something other than dismissal in his eyes. There was resignation. He signed the document. Zach let out a strangled noise, shaking his head wildly. No. No, no, no. This isn't happening. I slid the papers toward him. It is. Zach's chest heaved. He looked at my father, pleading. But my father just sat there silent. Because he knew. The empire he had tried to steal from me was never his to take. And now it was mine. Zach let out a ragged breath, his hand trembling as he grabbed the pen. He signed, his fingers curling against the page as if the ink itself burned him. I waited until the last signature was in place before I slid the documents back into my portfolio, snapping it shut. Then I stood. Effective immediately, I said, my voice calm, powerful. Carter Global is under my control. Zach sat there, frozen. My father, silent. The executive, stunned. And me? I smiled. Because the moment I had been waiting for, the moment they had never seen coming, had finally arrived. And it was just the beginning. The weight of the moment settled over the room like a dense fog. The legal documents, now signed, sat in front of me as a tangible testament to everything I had fought for. Zach slumped in his chair, his face pale and drawn, his fingers still curled around the pen as if he could somehow undo the damage with sheer force of will. My father sat stiffly beside him, his expression carved from stone, his eyes fixed on the polished mahogany table, as though if he looked up, the world around him would shatter. They had lost. And I had won. But I wasn't done yet. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers tapping lightly against the table. Now that the paperwork is finalized, let's discuss the transition. Zach let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp, almost hysterical. The transition? He finally looked up at me, his eyes wild with disbelief. You're actually making us sit through a damn transition meeting? I tilted my head. Of course. You're still stakeholders, technically. And I think it's important you both fully understand how this is going to work now. Zach shoved his chair back, pushing himself to his feet. You can go to hell, Natalie. I'm not sitting here and pretending this is normal. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Oh, but you are. Because you need to understand what happens next. Zach's jaw clenched, but my father finally raised his gaze to meet mine. His eyes were tired, but behind them, I could see the gears turning. He had spent decades controlling this company, maneuvering people like chess pieces, believing he was untouchable. And yet here he was, powerless. I turned my attention back to Zach. Sit down. Zach hesitated. Then, as if he realized there was nothing left to fight, he sank back into his chair, seething. I exhaled slowly, standing and walking toward the large screen at the front of the boardroom. With a tap on my tablet, the monitor lit up, displaying a detailed transition plan. This is how things will work moving forward, I began, my voice measured, steady. First, effective immediately, all executive privileges previously held by you, I turned to Zach, are revoked. Zach's lips curled into a snarl. Are you serious? Deadly. I continued, unbothered. Your access to company accounts, financials, and client information has already been terminated. I turned to my father. The same applies to you. While you will both retain your respective shares as silent partners, you will have no say in company decisions. My father's fingers twitched slightly, but he said nothing. Zach, on the other hand, was barely holding himself together. You're just cutting us out? I arched a brow. You cut me out first. I'm simply returning the favor. He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. I tapped on my tablet again, shifting the screen. Next, Carter Global will undergo a full rebranding. The company will be modernized, streamlined, and repositioned as an industry leader, separate from the outdated strategies that nearly drove it into the ground. My father flinched at that, but I pressed on. Staff restructuring will also begin immediately. Every executive who had a hand in the company's prior failings will be reviewed. Loyalty is one thing. Competency is another. Zach let out another sharp laugh, shaking his head. You're actually insane. I smiled. No, I'm just efficient. His fists clenched. You think you're better than us? I don't think, I said coolly. I know. Zach shot to his feet again, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floors. You think this makes you the winner? That you'll erase Dad's legacy and replace it with your own? He leaned forward, his voice a low snarl. You'll fail. You're just a glorified coder who got lucky. I met his gaze without flinching. You're right about one thing. I am replacing his legacy. I took a slow step closer, my voice dropping to an even tone. But luck had nothing to do with it. This was mine from the start. You were just too blind to see it. My father exhaled sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. What happens to us? I turned to him, tilting my head. What do you mean? He clenched his jaw. You took the company. You stripped us of power. You humiliated us. What now? Are you going to keep us around as a reminder of your victory? I studied him for a long moment. He had underestimated me at every turn. He had dismissed me, belittled me, treated me as though I was nothing more than an inconvenience in his grand design. And now, here he was, reduced to a man asking what came next. No, I said finally. I'm not keeping you around at all. Both he and Zach stiffened. I walked back to my chair and pulled out another set of documents. You have one final choice to make. I slid the papers toward them. Zach's face darkened. What the hell is this? A buyout, I said simply. A fair market valuation of your shares. You sign these, and you both walk away with a financial cushion. I leaned forward slightly. Or, you can keep your shares and watch me reshape this company into something unrecognizable without you. Zach's breath came fast and uneven. My father was silent. Then, slowly, he reached for the pen. Zach's eyes widened in disbelief. Dad? My father didn't look at him. Instead, he signed. Zach shot to his feet, the chair toppling over. You can't be serious. We're not just walking away. My father exhaled, setting the pen down. His voice was calm, almost too calm. She won. Zach's face twisted in fury. No, this isn't. I tapped on my tablet one last time, and the large screen shifted again to a live stock tracker. Carter Global's stock was fluctuating, but investors were already reacting to the transition. The smart ones saw the shift in leadership for what it was, a strategic move. They weren't panicking. They were adjusting. Zach swallowed hard. The realization hit him like a physical blow. I didn't just win. I had solidified my place in a way that was untouchable. And he was nothing. I slid the pen toward him. It's over, Zach. Sign. His fingers shook as he reached for it. He hesitated. For a long, drawn-out moment, I thought he would refuse, that his pride wouldn't allow him to surrender completely. But in the end, there was no choice. He signed. I picked up the documents, neatly tucking them into my portfolio. Then I stood, smoothing down my blazer. Goodbye, Zach. Goodbye, Dad. With that, I turned and walked out of the boardroom, the final nail in their coffin driven deep. Carter Global was mine, and the world had just been put on notice. The city skyline stretched before me, a sea of towering glass and steel reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new office, the one that had once belonged to my father, I could see everything. The streets below pulsed with life, cars weaving through the arteries of downtown, people moving with purpose, unaware that history had just been rewritten. My history. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, running a hand along the polished mahogany desk. It was mine now. All of it. The office. The company. The legacy. Carter Global, once a sinking relic of outdated leadership, was now under my command, and the world was watching. The headlines had already spread like wildfire. The rise of Natalie Carter, how she outsmarted her own family to reclaim her throne. A power shift like no other, Carter Global's bold new era. Betrayal and brilliance, the woman who took down an empire to build her own. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just a year ago, I had been invisible. My contributions ignored, my ideas dismissed, my efforts credited to men who had done nothing but stand in the right place at the right time. And now? Now I was the story. Now I was the face of one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in modern history. But success wasn't just about reclaiming what was stolen. It was about proving that I had always been the rightful heir. And proving it, I had. Carter Global had tripled in value in less than a year. With me at the helm, the company had expanded its reach beyond anything my father or Zach had ever dreamed of. The rebranding had been swift and aggressive, stripping away the old and ushering in the new. Outdated practices were eradicated, and in their place, I built something stronger, sharper, more efficient. We didn't just survive, we dominated. New investors flooded in, eager to align themselves with the woman who had rewritten the rules of business. Industry leaders who once hesitated now sought partnerships. Our competitors, once circling like vultures, were now scrambling to keep up. And Zach? Zach was nothing more than a footnote in my story now. The last I heard, he had attempted to start his own company, but without Carter Global's resources, without my software, without my team, he was lost. Investors weren't willing to take a gamble on a man who had already proven himself incompetent. He was no longer the heir to a kingdom. He was just another man who had been handed everything and squandered it. And my father? He had retired in disgrace. The business world had turned its back on him, recognizing that he had failed in the most spectacular way by underestimating the very person who had saved him. I should have felt triumphant. And in many ways, I did. But victory came with scars. I turned in my chair, reaching for the small, wrapped box on the corner of my desk. A birthday gift. One that had never been opened. It was meant for my father. Inside was a photo album, a carefully curated collection of memories from the very beginning of Carter Global. Pictures of his first office, his first deal, his first major success. A reminder of the empire he had built. A tribute to the legacy I had spent my life preserving. A legacy he had tried to steal from me. I traced my fingers over the ribbon, my throat tightening. There had been a time when I wanted nothing more than his approval. A time when I believed that if I worked hard enough, proved myself enough, he would finally see me. But now I knew better. Some people would never see you, no matter how brightly you shined. And that was their loss. I set the gift aside, my gaze returning to the view outside. This was my empire now, and I had built it without them. I had no interest in revenge anymore. I didn't need it, because the best revenge wasn't getting even. It was rising so high that those who betrayed you could never reach you again. And I had done just that. The gala was a spectacle of wealth and power, a gathering of the business world's most influential players, all dressed in their finest. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over the sprawling ballroom, and the air buzzed with conversation, champagne glasses clinking in a quiet symphony of celebration. It was an event for industry leaders, for those who had shaped the corporate landscape. And tonight, I was the guest of honor. I stood at the edge of the room, a glass of wine in hand, watching as people murmured my name with a mix of admiration and curiosity. A year ago, I had been an afterthought in my own family's company. Now, I was the force reshaping the industry. The whispers reached me even as I pretended not to hear. She's the one who took down her own father and brother. Can you believe how fast she turned the company around? She didn't just survive, she won. They weren't wrong. In the past 12 months, Carter Global had not only stabilized but thrived beyond expectations. The company had expanded into new markets, formed groundbreaking partnerships, and outpaced every competitor. Analysts called it the greatest corporate revival of the decade. And it was all because of me. I took a slow sip of my wine, my eyes scanning the crowd. Investors, CEOs, and industry moguls filled the room, each of them vying for my attention. But then I saw him. Gerald Carter. My father stood near the back of the ballroom, partially obscured by the shifting bodies of the crowd. He looked different. Older. Smaller. His once commanding presence had diminished, replaced by something unfamiliar, something I never thought I'd see in him. Regret. He had come alone. There was no entourage, no business partners clinging to his every word, no eager investors hanging on his promises. He was just a man standing in a room where he was no longer the center of attention. Our eyes met. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he made his way toward me, his steps deliberate. I remained still, my expression unreadable as he stopped in front of me. Natalie, he said finally, his voice quieter than I remembered. I took another sip of my wine before responding. Dad. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't think you'd want to see me. I arched a brow. Then why are you here? He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the crowd before returning to me. I needed to see it for myself. I tilted my head slightly. See what? He swallowed. What you built. His voice carried an edge of something raw, something close to admiration, though he didn't say the words. I read about it. I hear about it everywhere. But standing here, looking at you, it's different. I didn't respond immediately. For years, I had wanted this. Wanted him to acknowledge me, to see me. To recognize what I had done, what I had been capable of all along. And now, here he was, finally realizing the truth. But it was too late. I set my glass down on a nearby table and crossed my arms. You didn't think I could do it. He sighed, his shoulders sagging. No, I didn't. Honesty. It should have stung, but it didn't. Not anymore. I studied him for a long moment. And Zach? His jaw tightened, and he let out a slow breath. He's struggling. I didn't react. Zach had tried, desperately, to rebuild his own version of success after losing Carter Global, but the world didn't work the way he thought it did. Without a company handed to him, without my innovations, without my leadership, he had floundered. Investors had no faith in him. His attempts to start a new venture had failed spectacularly. Now, he was just another name in a long list of former heirs who had squandered their chances. And that was his own doing. My father met my gaze again. He still blames you. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Of course he does. Zach had always needed someone to blame for his failures. First, it had been our competitors. Then, the economy. Then, me. But the truth was simple, he had never been meant to lead. And deep down, I knew my father saw that now too. There was a pause before he spoke again, his voice lower. I was wrong. I lifted a brow, waiting. He cleared his throat. About you. About everything. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his tone, no condescension. Just raw, simple truth. And maybe, in another life, I would have craved this moment. But I didn't need it anymore. I straightened my shoulders, my voice calm but firm. It doesn't change anything. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he nodded. I know. Another long silence stretched between us. Then, after a moment, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A wrapped box. I stiffened. I don't expect you to open it now, he said, hesitating. Or ever. But I wanted to give it to you. I stared at the box, my fingers itching to reach for it, but I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I looked back up at him. What is it? He exhaled, a ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Something I should have given you a long time ago. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me not as an inconvenience. Not as a lesser. But as his equal. He set the box on the table beside my wine glass. Then, with a final nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there, unmoving, watching as the people of the business world continued to shift and sway around me, the weight of the moment settling deep in my chest. After a few minutes, I finally reached for the small box, turning it over in my hands. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I simply held it, letting it rest in my palm as a quiet reminder. Because at the end of the day, it didn't matter what was inside. I had already won. And I didn't need anyone, father, brother, or otherwise, to tell me what I had always known. I was unstoppable. And they would never reach me again.